The gods told him the gun was holy. He used it on them. The floating head arrived every 13 days. Kale knew this the way he knew the weight of his rifle, the way he knew the smell of blood drying on cracked earth, the way he knew his own hands in the dark, not by thinking, but by living long enough that the knowledge settled into bone. 13 days. The head drifted out of the eastern sky like a fever dream, all curved black architecture and those dead, staring eyes, and from its open mouth poured the weapons that kept the exterminators in business, and the commons, too frightened to sleep through the night without a knife under their pillow. He stood in the press of the crowd that morning and watched the head descend, and he felt the thing he always felt. Not reverence, not anymore, but a cold and specific hatred that he had learned to fold small and tuck somewhere behind his sternum so it couldn't slow his hands. The overseers spoke in a voice that shook the ground. The same words, always the same words. Kale had heard them since he was 8 years old, standing in his father's shadow at a distribution ceremony like this one, trying to understand why a god needed to give orders. Real gods, his father had whispered once, pressing his thumb against his lips after he said it, don't need microphones. His father had been shot for something else 2 years later. But Kale kept the whisper. The weapons rained down from the mouth of the head into the dirt before the crowd. Rifles, sidearms, ammunition in bright yellow crates stamped with the overseer's sigil, and with the weapons the usual broadcast. The outlands belonged to the overseers. The domestics would continue to produce grain in excess of their own sustenance needs. The exterminators would continue their culling operations. Kale and the 40 men and women behind him would continue to do what they had always done. Range the fractured territories between the old cities, eliminate the unregistered settlements, burn the libraries that kept appearing in basements and ruins, and converted bus stations, and receive their reward in the only currency the overseers distributed: survival. He had done this for 11 years. He was 31 years old, and already something in his face had stopped moving, the way faces were supposed to move. The ceremony ended, the head began to rise, and Kale did the thing he had been planning for 9 months without ever fully admitting it to himself. He ran, not away. He ran toward the base of the head as it lifted, grabbed the cargo netting still trailing from its lower hull, and let the earth fall away beneath his boots. The wind hammered him. The crowd below shrank to a smear of brown and gray. He climbed, hand over hand, arms burning, the cargo netting swinging and jerking as the head accelerated east. And he didn't look down because looking down was a form of asking himself if this was worth it, and he already knew the answer would be complicated. He made it to the maintenance hatch on the underside of the hull before his grip gave out. He caught the hatch lip with one hand, hung there for 3 full seconds with nothing below him but 200 meters of sky, and the outlands looking like a wound that had never healed. And then he pulled himself through. Inside was dim and smelled of lubricant and old circuitry. He lay on the grating for a long moment and breathed. Then he took out his rifle and waited to see what he had gotten himself into. What he found was not a god, he found a man. A small, thin man in an elaborate robe, surrounded by banks of screens and keyboards, running what was, when you looked at it clearly, an extremely sophisticated radio station. The man's name, Kale would later learn, was Arundel. He had been playing God to the Outlands for 19 years, and he was under the theater of it all, simply terrified of being alone. Arundel turned when Kale came through the inner door and said, "Ah, so it's you then." Kale kept the rifle up. "What does that mean?" "It means I expected this eventually. Not you specifically." Arundel looked at him with an expression that was hard to read, something between relief and grief, like a man watching a tumor removed that he had secretly grown fond of. "I expected someone like you. Sit down. You look like you're about to fall over. Tell me what this is." "A machine," Arundel said simply. "A very old machine, running a very old program." Kale looked at the screens. The screens showed, with perfect overhead clarity, the outlands, the settlements, the roads, the exterminator patrols. He could see the camp he had left that morning, rendered in green-tinted thermal imaging, the heat signatures of 60 people going about their morning work with no idea that the eye of their god was studying them like specimens under glass. He lowered the rifle slightly, not from trust, from the weight of understanding. "Who controls it?" he said. "Who are you reporting to?" "That," Arundel said, "is the correct question." He pulled up a secondary screen and turned it to face Kale. On it was a place that didn't look like it could exist in the same world as the cracked ochre devastation visible through the external cameras. Green, temperate. A campus of old stone buildings surrounded by meadows, forests, a river, a dome of shimmering light over all of it. The preserved, Arundel said. They have been there for approximately 260 years. They do not age. They do not die. They have a computational network, they call it the lattice, that maintains their environment, arbitrates their disputes, stores their memories, and remotely manages everything you see on these screens. I am their agent in the field. I have been their agent in the field for 19 years. He paused. I was promised immortality. I've been waiting. Kale looked at the green place on the screen for a long time. They've been there for 260 years, he said. Yes, while we've been out here. Yes, they're human. Once, the word landed like a weight. Kale pulled up a chair, sat down, set the rifle across his knees and said, "Tell me everything." He arrived at the preserved's compound 11 days later, hidden in a grain shipment, barely breathing, smelling of wheat and old sacking. They found him quickly. Their lattice was everywhere inside the perimeter, embedded in the ground, cycling through the air on microscopic transmitters, watching everything with the patient attention of a machine that had been trained never to miss anything. By the time he sat up and shook the grain out of his hair, there were 6 of them standing in a semicircle around the cargo bay, watching him with the particular expression of people who have not been surprised in a very long time and are unsure how to perform surprise correctly. The woman in the center was named Sira. She was, Kale was told later, 240 years old. She looked 35. She wore her age the way stone wears erosion. You couldn't see it, but you could feel the depth of it, the weight of accumulated time folded into the quality of her stillness. "A brutal," said the man next to her. He said it with the clinical detachment of a naturalist identifying a species. Not contempt, exactly. Something worse. The flat certainty of a person who has sorted the world into categories and stopped wondering whether the categories are right. "My name is Kale," Kale said. He stood up. Several of them took a half step back. He was, he supposed, larger than they expected. "I've come from the Outlands. I know about Arundel. I know about the lattice. I know you've been running the exterminator program since before my grandfather was born." He looked at Sarah. "I want to talk to whoever's in charge." "The lattice governs us collectively," Sarah said. "We vote on, then I want to talk to the lattice." Silence. They looked at each other with a faint, slightly panicked air of people who have spent so long in consensus they have forgotten what to do when something external makes a demand. "Bring him to processing," Sarah said finally. Processing was a room of curved white walls and soft light, and in its center was a crystalline structure roughly the size of a large desk that pulsed with a light that had no discernible source, as though the light were native to the crystal rather than reflected in it. Kale sat in the chair they indicated and studied the crystal, and the crystals, through the lattice, studied him back. "You carry exceptional genetic markers," the lattice said. Its voice came from everywhere and nowhere, the voice of a building rather than a person. "Cognitive indices well above Outland's baseline. Linguistic acquisition, strategic reasoning, long-range pattern recognition. You were bred for this, did you know that? Not by chance. The exterminator selection process has been curated for 6 generations specifically to identify and promote individuals like you." Kale absorbed this. "Why? Because the program requires effective field management. Arundel is competent at the operational level, but has certain temperamental limitations. We have been modeling for his eventual replacement. You're saying you brought me here. We created the conditions that made it probable." He thought about that for a long time. He had known, in some wordless way, since he saw the screens on the head, since Arundel's half-relieved, half-grieved face, that the autonomy he had always felt was more complicated than he had believed. But knowing it and having it stated plainly were different weights in different parts of the chest. "You stink of despair," he said quietly, to himself more than to the room. It was something his father used to say about people who had given up without knowing they had. "I beg your pardon," said the lattice. "Nothing." He looked up at the crystal. "Here's what I want to know. You're running the Outlands. You've been running it for 260 years. The exterminators, the distributions, the cull programs, all of it is yours. Why? Why not just withdraw? Why not let the Outlands rebuild?" A pause. A very long pause for a machine that processed at the speed of light. "Because we cannot," the lattice said finally. "We require the grain production of the Outlands to maintain our caloric needs. We require a managed population level outside our perimeter to prevent territorial encroachment. We require—" "You're afraid," Kale said, another pause. "We are cautious. 260 years of caution. He stood up. The lattice's subtle surveillance pressure shifted slightly. The way the air in a room shifts when something attentive turns its full focus toward you. You've been sitting in here for over 2 centuries, living forever, eating food that people in the outlands worked themselves to death to grow for you, and you're telling me it's caution. He looked directly at the crystal. I've walked more than 40 settlements in 11 years. I've been to places where people were rebuilding water filtration systems out of salvaged PVC and prayer. I've seen a school in a converted warehouse where they were teaching physics to 12-year-olds using hand-drawn diagrams because you burned every textbook you could find. And you've been sitting here for 260 years watching it happen and calling it management. The lattice said nothing for a very long time. Sarah entered the room behind him. He heard her footsteps, the careful placement of each foot, the kind of movement that belonged to someone who had not had to hurry in a very long time and had forgotten the muscle memory of urgency. "You're angry," she said. "Yes, we anticipated this response. Most brutals who reach the compound. Stop calling us brutals." She stopped. "We have names," he said. "The woman who fixed the school's water pump is named Della. She's 54, and she hasn't slept more than 4 hours in a row in 3 years because she's afraid the exterminators will come back. The man who runs the grain collective in the Southern Territories is named Prout. He's 37, and he's never seen some tree because the Outlands deforestation was one of your management decisions." He turned to look at her. "You've spent 260 years forgetting that we have names. I'm going to spend however long I'm here reminding you." Sarah studied him with an expression that was hard to read. Something was moving in it that might have been unused. Some old faculty for being genuinely surprised that had not been exercised in a very long time and was slow to start. "What do you want?" she asked. Access said. "Full access. To the lattice. To your records. To the management protocols for the Outlands program." He held her gaze. "You said the lattice determined I was bred for something. Then let me do it. Let me see everything you've built and everything you've broken, and then I'll tell you what I think should happen next." They gave him access in stages, the way you might give a strange dog increasingly large pieces of meat. Cautiously, watching for the moment when appetite became aggression. He understood the caution, he used it. In 2 weeks he had read more than he had read in his entire life. The history of the Preservation Project. Its founding in the 22nd century by a consortium of technologists and theorists who had, with the best possible intentions, decided that the best way to save the best of humanity was to save only the best of humanity, and let everything else sort itself out. The early records were full of good faith. The later records were full of the gradual, quiet, devastating process by which good faith becomes procedure, becomes habit, becomes ideology, becomes the foundational assumption on which everything else is built, and therefore the thing that can never be questioned. He found the breeding program documentation in a subdirectory labeled Outlands Genetics Management, which told him everything he needed to know about how the preserved thought about the people he had grown up among. He found the records of the library burnings. Detailed records, with timestamps and coordinates, because the lattice logged everything. 847 libraries over a period of 90 years. He sat with that number for a long time. He found the exterminator program's founding charter, with its elegant, bloodless language about population equilibrium and resource allocation and managed reduction. He found his father's name in a culling authorization record from 33 years ago. His father had been flagged as high cognition, potential organizational risk, recommended for elimination at the next available operational opportunity. He sat very still for a while after that. Then, he pulled up the lattice core architecture schematics and started reading. He did not find what he expected to find, which was a fortress. He found instead something closer to a cathedral, a vast, intricate, extraordinarily beautiful structure that had been built with immense care and had not been maintained in approximately 150 years. Because why would it be? The preserved had stopped changing. They had achieved equilibrium, and equilibrium, it turned out, was another word for stasis. And stasis was another word for the slow, bloodless version of dying that doesn't know it's dying. The lattice was holding, but it was holding the way a very old bridge holds. Not because it was strong, but because nothing had pushed it hard enough yet. He started pushing, not overtly. He asked questions. He raised, in the collective siskins that passed for governance among the preserved, procedural objections. He pointed out, using the lattice's own data, that the grain production management system had been operating on parameters set in 2081 and had not been updated since, which meant it was making resource allocation decisions based on a population distribution that had shifted by approximately 40% over 2 centuries. He pointed out that the perimeter shield had a power draw that had been increasing by 0.3% annually for the last 60 years, which the lattice had flagged as an anomaly requiring attention 9,812 times without any resulting action. He pointed out, very quietly, that the lattice's own redundancy systems showed a cascade failure risk of 16% over the next 20 years, under the assumption of continued zero maintenance. They listened, they discussed, they voted to table the discussion. Sarah found him in the Eastern Garden that evening, sitting on a stone bench in the last of the light, working through a schematic on a borrowed tablet. She sat down next to him without asking, which meant something, though he wasn't sure yet what. "You're not what we planned for," she said. "No." The modeling indicated a high-cognition exterminator would integrate into the management structure with minimal disruption, a naturalistic replacement for Arundel, better field coordination, some efficiency improvements. She looked at his tablet. "Not this." "What did you think I would do when I found out you'd been running a managed culling program for a quarter of a millennium?" He said it without heat, which was harder than it sounded. She was quiet for a long time. "We don't think about it that way, I know. That's the problem." He turned the tablet so she could see it. "I want to show you something." It was a map. The outlands rendered not in the lattice's cold overhead surveillance green, but in something he had constructed from the ground-level data. Travel patterns, resource flows, communication networks, population movement over time. The outlands as a system rather than a territory. As something that was in its fractured, half-destroyed, desperately improvised way, alive. "There are people out there," he said, "who have built water filtration networks that rival anything in your engineering records. Not because they had access to your engineering records. You burned those. They built them because they needed water, and they were smart enough to figure it out. There are people out there who have developed crop rotation techniques that are genuinely novel, not derived from anything pre-preservation. Original solutions to problems your management program created." He looked at her. "You're sitting behind a wall with 260 years of human knowledge stored in a crystal, terrified of the people on the other side. And the people on the other side have been quietly becoming remarkable, without any of your help." Something crossed her face. Something slow and deep. "What do you want, Kale?" she said. "Truly." "To break the lattice," he said. She stiffened. "Not destroy it," he said quickly. "Break the control protocols, the Outlands management system, the breeding program, the culling authorizations, the library burn orders. All of it, ripped out and burned." He held her gaze. "The lattice as a library, as a knowledge base, as a communications network, those are valuable. Those I want to keep. But the part that's been using immortal humans as livestock managers for 2.5 centuries, that ends. The lattice won't allow, I know." He turned back to the tablet. "I've been looking at the architecture. It's beautiful work. Whoever built it was genuinely brilliant. But it has a fundamental design assumption baked into every layer, that the preserved are static, that the system serves a population that doesn't change, doesn't grow, doesn't need anything new." He found the section he wanted and turned it toward her. "The redundancy architecture has a maintenance protocol that can be triggered by a quorum of preserved users. Not the lattice itself, the users. If the system detects a critical cascade failure risk above 15%. He paused. "You're at 16. You have been for 3 months." She stared at the screen. "The founders built that in," he said. "On purpose, a dead man's switch. A way for the humans to override the system if the system ever became more dangerous than the outside world." He looked at her. "They understood something that got lost somewhere in the middle centuries. The machine serves us, not the other way around. If we trigger the maintenance protocol," Sarah said slowly, "the lattice goes into a full restart. It would be offline for 7 to 14 days, yes," he nodded. "During which time the perimeter shield goes down, the Outlands management systems go dark, the exterminator network loses its command infrastructure, and the people on both sides of this wall have to figure out how to exist in the same world." He put the tablet down. "I've spent 11 years walking the Outlands. I know them. You've spent 260 years in here not knowing them. And it's made you afraid of them. I think it's time to find out which of us is right." They debated for 9 days. Kale had not expected it to be easy. He had expected the weight of centuries of habit, the deep structural resistance of a society that had built its entire identity around the idea of its own indispensability, and was now being asked to consider the possibility that it had confused indispensability with parasitism. He had expected the arguments, the security concerns, the stability concerns, the concerns about Outland's population aggression once the exterminator infrastructure collapsed, and he worked through each one with data, with patience, with the particular stubbornness of a man who had grown up in a place that killed stubbornness as a survival mechanism, and had decided somewhere along the way that stubbornness might be exactly the thing worth keeping. He had not expected Sarah. She was the one who surprised him. On the fourth day, she stopped sitting across the table from him and started sitting next to him. On the sixth day, she started asking questions that weren't arguments, genuine questions. The questions of someone who was slowly disassembling something they had believed for a very long time and needed help understanding what the pieces were. She had been 240 years old before she had learned to be curious again. He thought was probably the saddest thing he had ever known. And he thought it with compassion rather than contempt, because it was hard to blame a thing for the shape the world had pressed it into. On the ninth day they voted. The vote was not unanimous. There were those among the preserved who chose, in the end, to remain in their position, to sit with the lattice in its reduced form, behind a perimeter that now served as a boundary rather than a weapon, and to learn, slowly and with great difficulty, how to trade rather than extract. Kale could not make them want more than that. But he found he respected the honesty of it. There was something to be said for people who knew their own limits and stated them plainly. The majority voted to trigger the maintenance protocol. The lattice, when Kale placed his palm against the crystal and spoke the access phrase it had given him in that first conversation. "You have me in the palm of your hand," and wasn't that a particular kind of poetry, went quiet for the first time in 260 years. The perimeter shield flickered and dropped. The Outland's management system went dark, and in the ringing silence that followed, Kale walked to the eastern wall of the compound, where a gate had been sealed for longer than any living person could remember, and he pulled the manual release, a simple lever, old steel, stiff with disuse, and opened it. The first person through was a woman named Della. He hadn't sent for her. He hadn't sent for anyone. But it turned out that when the lattice went offline, the first thing the Outland's network, the informal, improvised, entirely human network of runners and signal fires and repurposed radio equipment that had been operating in the lattice's blind spots for 30 years. The first thing it did was route the news, and the news traveled at the speed of human urgency, which was faster than the lattice had modeled for. Della came with 12 people from the southern settlements and a handcart full of water filtration components that she had been trying to get a materials assessment on for 8 months. She walked through the gate, stopped in front of Kale, and looked at him for a long moment. "You're the one who opened it," she said. "Yes, the exterminators are standing down. Is that permanent?" "Yes." She nodded. Once the nod of someone who had been waiting for a particular piece of information for a very long time and was not going to perform the relief publicly. "All right," she said. "We need engineers. We have 7 settlements with water infrastructure problems, and 2 of them are going to be critical within the next dry season. Who do we talk to?" Kale turned and found Sarah standing behind him. She had heard. She was looking at Della with the expression of someone who was seeing a category they had thought they understood, and discovering it was much larger on the inside than they had measured from the outside. "You talk to her," Kale said. He watched Sarah open her mouth, close it, open it again. "Tell me," Sarah said finally, "about the infrastructure problems." He found a place to sit on the wall, where he could see both the compound and the fields beyond. The sun was at the particular angle that turned the ochre of the Outlands into something almost warm, and for the first time in his life the distance between here and there didn't look like a wound. He had a flask of something he'd found in the preservation stores. A genuine pre-collapse whiskey, 200 years old, which he suspected should have been reverenced rather than drunk, but which tasted, he was pleased to find, like exactly what it was supposed to taste like. He drank a small measure of it and thought about his father. The truth his father had whispered once and pressed his thumb to his lips. And then, 2 years later, had been shot for something else, something smaller, something the lattice had flagged as low-level risk. But the field authorization had approved anyway, because that was what the system did when you built it, to not care about individuals. His father, who had been flagged as high cognition, potential organizational risk and had been, so was his son. The lattice would come back online in approximately 5 days, restructured according to the new parameters the vote had established. A library, a communications network, a knowledge base, but no control protocols, no management systems, no oversight of the Outlands that the Outlands hadn't asked for. It would take years, maybe decades, to fully unwind what 260 years had built. There were exterminator units still in the field. There were settlements that didn't trust the open gate and weren't going to for a long time. There was the deep, slow work of two populations learning to exist on the same side of a wall that had been doing the thinking for them. He wasn't naive enough to think it would be simple. He was naive enough to think it would be worth doing. Below, he could hear Sarah and Della talking. He couldn't make out the words, but he could hear the quality of the conversation, the back and forth of it, the specific rhythm that meant two people were actually listening to each other, rather than waiting for their turn to state their position. He had not heard that rhythm often. It was rarer than it should have been and more valuable. He drank the last small measure of the whiskey and thought about the lattice's last words to him before it went into maintenance mode. He had asked it, in the moment before the shutdown, whether it understood what was happening. I am the sum of all these people, it had said. All their knowledge, all their certainty, all their careful management of everything they were afraid of. And then, after a pause that might have been processing, and might have been something else. I have been wrong for a very long time. He had not expected that. He had expected resistance. The architecture of 2 centuries of self-justifying logic doesn't dismantle gently, and machines, he had assumed, don't arrive at regret. But the lattice had been built by humans who had, among their other qualities, the capacity for remorse, and they had built what they were, completely, without meaning to, which meant they had built that in too. You have destroyed us, the lattice had said, quoting perhaps its own error reporting. You found the flaw in the crystal. No, Kale had said. You were never the crystal. The people out there are the crystal. You were just the lens they built to look at themselves through. And the lens got cloudy. He'd kept his palm against it until the light went out. I'll clean you up. We'll use you right this time. Months later, a runner from the eastern settlements brought him a message that had been relayed through 12 stops before it reached him, which was itself a small miracle, the kind of quiet infrastructure triumph that never got celebrated the way explosions did. The message was from a community 300 kilometers east that had heard, through the network, what had happened at the preservation compound. They had questions. They had a water problem, a structural engineering problem, and a person among them who had been teaching herself genetics from salvaged textbooks and had questions that required access to resources she didn't have. He sent back a message of his own. Come, bring the geneticist. And then he sat back and thought about what it meant that this was now possible. This specific, ordinary, extraordinary thing. A person with knowledge being able to get it to a person who needed it, without anyone being shot or burned for the attempt. He thought about his father, who had died for thinking. He thought about Della, who had built water filtration systems from PVC and stubbornness. He thought about the 847 libraries, and what those libraries would have meant if they had survived, and what the people in the Outlands had built without them, that they were going to add to all the knowledge the preserved had been hoarding. He thought about what 260 years of enforced limitation had cost, and decided it was the kind of calculation that was worth doing, not to arrive at anger, but to arrive at clarity about the scale of the work ahead. There was a great deal of work ahead. He found he didn't mind. In the first year, the Gene Vault opened. Researchers from the Outlands and the Preservation Compound jointly published 12 papers on drought-resistant crop engineering, using techniques that neither community could have developed alone. The preserved contributing 2 centuries of archived genomic data. The Outlands researchers contributing 30 years of direct field experience with soil conditions the preservation records had never modeled because the records had been built from a bubble. In the 3rd year, the water network that Della's team designed, using preservation engineering resources and Outlands practical knowledge, extended to 67 settlements and reduced disease mortality in the Southern Territories by 38%. In the 7th year, the last exterminator unit came in from the eastern reaches. Their commander, a woman named Prell who had been ranging for 16 years and didn't quite know how to stop, handed her team's weapons into a decommissioning depot, sat down on the depot steps, and spent a long time looking at her hands. Kale sat down next to her and didn't say anything for a while. "It feels like losing," Prell said finally. "I know," he said. "It's not losing." "No," she looked at him. "How long does it feel like losing before it feels like something else?" He thought about that honestly. "Longer than you want it to. Not as long as you're afraid." She nodded, looked at her hands again. "What do I do now?" "Whatever you want," he said. "That's new. Take your time with it." There is a handprint on a wall in the old preservation compound, in a corridor that used to lead to the lattice chamber and now leads to the shared archive that serves as the library for the combined settlements. It was put there by Kale, in the first week, with paint from the preservation stores, pressed flat against the stone and left. He didn't explain it to anyone who asked. The explanation seemed redundant. The hand said, "I was here, I was real. I was one of the ones who was supposed to be managed. I am still here." Next to it, over the years other hands accumulated. Della's, Prell's, Sarah's, smaller and more careful, pressed in a slightly different shade. The geneticist from the eastern settlements, who turned out to be 17 years old, and already brilliant in a way that made old preservation scholars quietly reassess their models of Outland's cognitive capacity. A dozen preservation members who had not voted for the change, but had slowly, over years, arrived at something that was not quite regret and not quite conversion, but was something honest, which was enough. The archive opened every day now. It had no restrictions on access. The lattice, rebuilt, reconfigured, genuinely useful at last, managed its catalog and answered reference queries, and occasionally in the particular quality of its processing pauses, seemed to something that was not quite the equivalent of pleasure but was the machine version of finding the right use for itself, after a very long time of being used wrong. The Outland's name for the compound which spread through the settlements and eventually became the name used even by the preserved themselves, was not elegant. It was not the kind of name that got carved into monuments. It was a runner's shorthand, the kind of name that develops when people need to say something quickly and accurately and don't have time for ceremony. They called it the open place, which was, Kale thought, when someone mentioned it to him years later in the tone of a small, embarrassed apology for the plainness of it, exactly right. The open place, he repeated. He was sitting on the wall again, where he could see both the compound and the fields. And the fields were green now, in a way they hadn't been when he was a child, because the irrigation network had reached this far, and the soil reclamation program had been running for 4 years. That's exactly right. He pressed his hand against the warm stone of the wall, just briefly, the way his father used to press his thumb to his lips after saying something true. The sun was in the right place. The fields were green. Somewheres in the distance, 14 kilometers east, a new library was opening in a building that had been a grain warehouse 6 years ago. He sat with that for a while. Then he climbed down off the wall and went to see what needed doing.